Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds. I'm Nerdarchy Dave, and today I'm hanging out with Vanessa Hoskins. How are you doing today?
I'm doing actually really well today.
Awesome. So you have a ton of credits to your name for Pathfinder, Paizo. I think I saw some Starfinder in there as well.
There's some Starfinder in there as well.
And you do a bunch of podcasting actual plays.
So many, probably too many.
So, so before we jump into things, I just want to tell people where they can find you, and I conveniently put some links in the pinned comment for folks to find them.
Cool.
So, we just met recently, which is cool, and you're not too far from us here in Jersey, which is also cool, especially when we're dealing with people all over the world. How long have you been writing for Paizo?
I've been writing for Paizo for almost exactly 5 years. My very first scenario from Under Ice came out in April of 2015, and I've been writing for them since.
Do you have like a favorite type of thing to write?
Oh gosh, I'm probably best well known for the adventures that I write. I have written, I made a list. I've written several, almost 10 different first edition adventures, and now that second edition is out, I'm already up to like 2 different adventures and going. So
Were you part of any of the development for a second?
I was not part of initial development. That was all done in-house by Paizo.
Okay.
But I did heavily participate in the playtest, so for what it's worth.
So, at what point did you know you wanted to write for RPGs?
At what point did I know I wanted to write for them? I think I have been creating games, like homebrew games, since college, essentially. Our college group didn't even realize that, they published adventures. We played D&D 3.5 way back in the day, and, 3.0 when it came out, and purchased all the books, all the core books anyway, and just used those and made our own worlds and our own adventures. And it wasn't until years later that I was invited to go to a local gaming convention and heard about Pathfinder and was like, wow, they have all these adventures. Do the GMs make them? And they're like, no, they're published. And I thought, that's crazy. Someone gets paid to write these? And from that moment, I knew I wanted to do it. And it took several years after that for me to finally get on that writing roster and get published. So.
Well, before Pathfinder, that's what Paizo was known for,
Mm-hmm.
was writing adventures, writing adventure paths. They used to publish Dragon and Dungeon magazine prior. So yeah, it's kind of like it's been always been their bread and butter. And we were the same the way we gamed. We really didn't use published adventures. So how about now?
Now it's funny. After getting involved in the Pathfinder Society, the organized play program, I started at first like running these adventures that were written by someone else, and it was a really difficult change. It was like, wait, I have to look this up and make sure I do it right because it says so on the paper. I can't just make it up and come up with something. And so that was a bit of a challenge. And over time, I got really used to it. And I still have those GM improvisational skills that I get to flex every once in a while. But yeah, for a long time, at least the last several years, I have been running so many pre-published adventures. That is sort of my default now, is getting used to reviewing, prepping, and running those.
The one of the cool things now, we were talking off air a little bit that I started playing this Saturday game, and the actual designer is the one that runs the adventure for us, which is kind of a cool experience.
Yeah, that's really neat.
So Fire BR47 has a question. How do you approach writing scenarios, as in, do you have a process that you feel works for you?
Well, the good news is a lot of the stuff I get from Paizo does have an outline that usually says, here's the points we're trying to hit. And usually what I do is I try and put myself in the world and think, if I'm in this sort of adventure with these hooks that I need to hit, right? Here's the adventure hook. Here's what the PCs need to do by the end of it. And I try to figure out what's the genre, what are some cool things that can go in. And I have a very sort of top-down design of what do I want the overall experience to be, and then how am I going to execute that experience.
So do you prefer like working within that outline, or do you like it when you can go free form and just kind of do whatever you want?
You know what? Both are pretty liberating. I've written a few actually big dungeon crawl adventures where they essentially hand you a map and say, okay, here's your map, make an adventure out of it. And those are actually kind of fun because it gives you a prompt, right? You're not just looking at a blank sheet of paper. You're going, okay, here's this room that definitely looks like this and definitely has these doors and is set up this way. What might be in that room based on what I know of this area and what's there? And what's even more fun, I think, is when it's like, oh, this is an ancient ruin. So you think, what was originally in that room? And what's in that room now? And why has that changed? And how has that changed the room? And can you tell both stories through the room description, through the equipment that's there, through the monsters that you put in the room? And that's really fun. Although sometimes working from whole cloth is nice because you're just going to go, wait, I have this bonkers idea that requires a custom map. Can I have a custom map? Yes. Cool. We're going to do that.
So, of the projects you worked on, do you have a favorite? Can you pick your favorite child?
That is so mean. Why would you do that to me? I'd say right now, one of my favorites. Right now, one of my favorites is something that's as of yet unannounced, but is one of those mega dungeons. So
Ooh.
I'll leave it at that. But
Can we say what it's for?
um, it's one of the Finder products.
Okay.
I'll go that far. But yeah, it's something that I'm just like, that's the hardest part is writing things that you're super excited about and that you really want to talk about and you can't because NDAs exist. But
Mm-hmm.
soon it will be out in the world.
So, I take it now. Well, not. I guess I want to say recent, but it's not really that recent anymore. Starfinder's been out, so now So now you're able to stretch into more sci-fi type writing. Uh, do you prefer that or fantasy?
I prefer fantasy over science fiction, although I really like the science fantasy world that Starfinder's created because you can do very technologically focused adventures. In fact, I wrote an adventure path that is far more technological than, say, fantastical or magical for Paizo for Starfinder. It's part of their threefold conspiracy line, and mine's called the Cradle Infestation, and it's all about reptoids and gray aliens and mind controlling fungus that are trying to take over the galaxy and your part in it. And so, like, that one was a lot more science focused, and that was a blast. But then there's also the nice part where sometimes you're like, how do I want to make this work? And you can go, you know what? I'm just going to make this like a magical event or some sort of magical environmental effect where maybe this planet has, wild magic running through it or something. And you have sort of that fun wild card option to add magic into the science fiction, and I think that's just such a fun mix.
Yeah, I think I would say I'm kind of very similar that way, or at least I was probably for the first like 20 so years of gaming. And
Mm-hmm.
then at some point, like something switched and I just got bored of fantasy and
Mm-hmm.
started like moving in different directions, even in like my reading and stuff. Like I had a whole phase where I just started reading steampunk just because I've been like, all right, I've been reading fantasy forever. It feels like I just need something else.
Yeah, it is nice for the creative muscles too to just go in a different direction, right? I'm not dealing with you know fighters and rogues anymore. Now I have soldiers and mystics and things like that, and it's like, okay, technomancers, and it's like, okay, this does let me sort of think in different ways, right? Now I have an infosphere, kind of like the internet, to deal with, and I can't just say, I don't know, you don't know what this creature is, when someone can go, wait, let me just go online. Yep, this is what this is. Okay.
Well, I also find it's really useful just in the sense of even if you're playing or running or writing fantasy, just going into these other genres,
Mhm.
it gives you new ideas and new ways to look at some of the stuff you've been playing with for a while too. So I kind of find that helpful.
Yeah, it gives you a new perspective on things, and it's sort of just a new way to approach it, which I think helps inform writing in other genres as well. Because then you're like, I was writing this conspiracy thing and I did this thing that worked really well. I bet it would also work well over here. So that's kind of fun.
So Firebrat has a follow up question for you.
Okay.
With the chaotic nature of the game, players for that matter, is it difficult to write to maintain a semi-linear storyline, but cater to non-linear ways of delivering the story?
It's not difficult if you put in sort of the right supports. It's kind of like, is it difficult to build a house on stilts? Well, no, but if you know you're building a house on stilts, then you know what you need to adapt for, you know what you need to do. So if you know that this is like, okay, the players are definitely going to experience this linearly, but it's not necessarily like a linear adventure, or they might, you know, even in a linear adventure, they might go off on the rails and do something weird and need to be brought back. And when you write the adventure, then you want to essentially create a lot of like narrative connective tissue. So if you're in scene A and you need to get to scene B, you want like 3 different ways to get there, especially if it feels sort of sandboxy. You want to say, okay, they can find a hint on someone who attacks them in this alleyway, or they can, you know, talk to the shopkeeper who knows a bit about it, or it's possible that they find, you know, the remnants of a ritual that they can sort of reverse engineer and figure out, oh, here's where they got these components. Let's go there. And so with some of these different methods, you can make sure that the GM who's running your adventure later, who has players with, you know, wacko ideas, can still say, I can use that and figure out how to incorporate this to get to the next scene.
So we have another question from you for you from the chat. Dark Web wants to know, what is your favorite monster for Pathfinder 1E or 2E?
1E or 2E. For first edition, my favorite monster, because it is very similar to my own last name, and also it is very unfair, is the Hobkins Gremlin. There are these little gremlins that are slightly out of phase with reality, and if you miss an attack on them, they get to redirect it somewhere else, which is pretty cool. And their whole shtick as gremlins is trying to not only just destroy like objects, but get you to destroy your own stuff. So if they get, say, in your house, and you're like, oh, there's a gremlin in my house, and you cast, you know, acid splash at it, and it misses. Great. Now that acid splash is going to go hit, you know, your grandmother's china or something, and you've just melted it. And they just think that is hilarious. And they're such a nuisance of fun. I just love them. I think they're really cool.
That is a great monster. So
I made a swashbuckler Hobkins once and really wanted to put it in an adventure. And my developer said, no, we want people to keep playing this game.
Some people, they're just no fun.
It's fine.
Like that. So of the actual plays you're involved with, how many are you playing in and how many are you running?
Oh my goodness, probably far too many. I'm a primary cast member currently in one actual play that's currently recording, GMing one, and a guest cast member in 2. So I'm involved in 4 actual play podcasts currently.
Nice. And which one are you running?
So I'm running the Against the Aeon Throne adventure path in Starfinder, and that's part of that's part of an actual play called Stellar on the No Direction Network.
Oh, nice. And if you look at Vanessa's bio in the pinned comments, you can find those as well. Mm-hmm. So how do you like playing in actual plays compared to, you know, just like for fun? How do they match up?
They both have their positives about it, the things that make them very cool. In an actual play, it's kind of neat. It's very performative. And you definitely have to sort of know your character in and out, and you have to know what you're doing so that when it's your turn, there's not a lot of hemming and hawing. You can just go with it, which is great. The really fun part about it, though, is that when you get to engage with the community and they're like, oh, I listened to the latest episode, and when your character did this, what were they thinking, or how was that working? And that's so much fun, because when we play our games, just casually, and then we talk to other gamers, we're always like, oh, let me tell you the story about an adventure that, I played where I brought this airship and the GM didn't know I was bringing an airship, right? Which I have a story about that. And it's so much fun to relate these stories to each other. Well, with an actual play, the story's already there, and you can jump right to the part of like talking about it and what are you going to do next and on all that. And that's really fun for me.
I will also say with the actual plays and streaming, you have the community as well, which is like becomes a whole new component of the game.
Sure does.
I know that we've played in quite a few stream games where it's live, where you're doing podcasts, so it's recorded, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the chat as well, And both as a player and a DM, it can be fun to interact over there. I've definitely, as the DM, won't necessarily interact with the chat, but I watch it. So if they say something that looks fun or cool, I will definitely insert it into a scene, which then makes them super happy that they got to kind of like take part.
Yeah, I find that the community watching live while we're recording is actually a huge benefit. Not only because they often have hilarious puns or things to say, they'll sometimes help us with rules questions where something comes up and we're like, oh, you know what? Especially like second edition is so new to everybody. And we're like, you know what? I don't think I've run into how these mechanics interact. I guess we'll have to stop and look that up. And someone in chat's like, oh, paste, here's the rule. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, that is also one of the things about that can be a little bit tricky about when you're playing live. I will generally just make something up and we can figure out the real rules later, just to keep things moving. So Sean wants to know, when designing tabletop RPGs, how much do you want to set up for the players and how much space do you leave for them to make it their own?
That is an excellent question. And a lot of the answer to that question depends on the company that's publishing it. So for Paizo, traditionally they cover a lot of the bases in terms of exacting box text, right? They want to say, here's a room description, here's the read aloud text for that area. And they want a lot of things prescribed out, and they still leave some wiggle room for you to adapt. But there are a lot of things that are, I don't want to say scripted, but definitely baked into the adventure module. Versus I've written for a couple other publishers that specifically want it really loose. I've written for John Brazier Enterprises, done an adventure path for them, not quite out yet, but that's for first edition. And that one, they specifically want this to be loose enough that the GM can do a lot of different things. And so when I'm writing, rather than saying, here's exactly how this goes down, I get to write and say, here's a couple ways that you could handle the situation, so that the GM has some options to work with, or maybe something to spark their imagination and do it a completely different way.
I don't know if you saw on Twitter a while back, there was a big thread about box text versus no box text. I believe it was James Narcaso, who we had on Monday, actually. I think he's trying to spearhead the no box text movement.
Yeah, I am a fan of it as someone who writes it, because I know for me as an author, I will sometimes, and not every single room, but some rooms I will very specifically word things in a certain way, or try and give very specific hints that I don't want the GM to miss. Like, I think it's really important for the PCs, for example, to get the hint that there's water dripping down in the ceiling in this room. And so that's part of the box text. Maybe the sound of the constantly plunking water is in there, things like that. And if the GM is like, and I don't know, and it's like there's water in the room or something, and like glosses over it and misses that, the players might also miss it and then not realize, wait, there's something you could do there with this water. It's a hint, it's a clue to something else. And so I like the box text for that reason, because then I can really word things exactly the way I want to make sure it gets to the players in the right way.
That makes a lot of sense if you're using the box text to call out specific things that you want the players to investigate or look at. Yeah, absolutely. That would make sense. So we were starting to talk a little bit before we went live about, you know, how you got started playing the game. So what is your experience? What was your intro into gaming?
Oh, I was a very small child. Excuse me.
No worries.
I was a little short child when I first got into gaming. I had been playing RPGs on my Super Nintendo, specifically the Final Fantasy series. And I remember that my uncle got really excited about it and wanted to play. So he invited me over to his house to play for a bit when all of his friends were going to come over and play Rollmaster. And I remember my mother was specifically very sure that it wasn't D&D, because D&D is evil, but it's Rollmaster. Okay, well, that's not D&D, so it's okay. So we went over there, and essentially I spent about 4 hours making a Rollmaster character. And anyone who's played Rollmaster knows it takes 4 hours. It is involved. And so, especially when you've never done it before. So I'm making this Rollmaster character, and my uncle's playing my Final Fantasy game in his computer because I brought it over. His friends come over, and we play the game. And I make this big, tough barbarian with like 2 giant swords. And in the first round of combat, the first hit, he gets crit and brutally murdered. And I still had so much fun, but I'm like, I want to play. So I quickly try to make another character. A few hours later, I finally have the character rolled up, ready to go. It's this elven archer, decently heavy armor. I'm not going to die in one shot. I'm going to stand way in the back. Okay. What happens? Spellcaster knocks me off a cliff and into a bunch of water, and I drown. First round of combat. And I had a blast. And after that, I've been wanting to play RPGs my whole life.
I think the first game I played like that was the first Lord of the Rings game, and it was like whatever the DM rolled, it was it was a crit, and it was like you take an arrow through your ear, instantly clears all earwax. Oh, and you're dead.
I think that might have been Rollmaster. So Rollmaster was heavily influenced by the Tolkien genre and the Middle Earth setting. I don't think it was explicitly in there, but it was definitely influenced. So
yeah, I feel like all those games kind of were. I know I'm gonna commit some heresy here, but yeah, I actually got very bored of the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. I feel like if I would have I read those first before I started reading other things, and they were great. But if I were to go back and read them now, they would bore me to tears. It was like most of it is them running away from stuff. I just prefer like high action, high fantasy. The movies, in my opinion, were so much better than the books. So
right.
And I know plenty of people who are like, I read those books every year.
Yeah, I think the biggest series of books that really got me into it as well was like the Dragonlance series. I was a huge fan of those. I have somewhere in my office here, both annotated, chronicles and legends, and would want to reread it and see what the authors had to say about it. They were a huge influence on me, certainly.
Yeah, Dragonlance was probably where I went after Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and then like I read everything except for the twin books, which was like the big thing in my friend group was reading about Raceland and Cameron, and somehow I like skipped those but read everything else. and then the Moonshade trilogy and all the Forgotten Realms book. Not exactly like high literature. I consider it like mental junk food, but I would like read a book every like 2 to 3 days. In my teens.
Yeah, but it's fun, and when you're in an industry like this, it's fuel. Even if it's junk food, it's still fuel.
So yeah, absolutely. So we get another question from Firebrat here. Now that you've been paid for creating materials, do you spend more time on making characters for yourself or the ones planning to be published?
I think I definitely approach them from very, very different ways. I probably still spend more time on characters I'm making for myself, especially for the actual play podcasts, because I don't just want that Magus who is untouchable, right? I want the character who like has interesting backstory, has some hooks, some things for the GM to sort of pull on and explore. And for a character for myself, I'm very much looking for a way for them to grow. I usually try to make characters from here's where they are and here's where they need to be by the time the adventure is over, so that they can experience some sort of arc throughout the adventure, because I'm in a very narrative format with an actual play. For a home game, I'm probably a little loosey-goosey about it. Now, for the things to be published, a lot of those characters are usually adversaries and usually don't have nearly as much depth. You want a little bit of dimension, so you don't get a two-dimensional villain. You want a little bit of like, why are they there? What are they doing? But mostly on those ones, I focus on mechanics and not power game, make it as strong as possible, but how can I make it so that this is going to be an interesting encounter? And with especially first edition Pathfinder, building NPCs is very much a balancing act of not going too powerful and not going too weak, and making sure that PCs will be able to deal with the monstrosity NPC you've created.
When I make NPCs or characters for the games that I'm running, I barely create anything for them. I generally won't even do the stats, and if the players are interested in that NPC, then we begin fleshing them out, because everyone knows it's always the NPCs that you don't plan anything for that they attach themselves to. for whatever reason.
That's true.
So, so I tend to just I let them pick, and then we begin fleshing them out as we play. Before we went live, you were telling me about RPG Superstars?
Yeah, so one of the projects I'm involved right now is the relaunch of RPG Superstar. This is a big contest that Paizo did for once a year for years at a time, and they would use it as a way to find new talent in the RPG community. So if you had a certain number of published credits or something like that, you couldn't, you didn't qualify. They wanted essentially undiscovered talent. I think it was, less than 3 publications. It's like, let's just find folks who haven't really done any more than maybe dip their toe in the industry and see what we can find. And it was a fantastic contest, huge community involvement. But at some point, I think Paizo's stable of freelancers became large enough that they really didn't have a need for the contest anymore. And they just stopped doing it. Well, recently, Roll for Combat, one of the networks I'm involved with for actual plays, has partnered with Paizo and is revitalizing the RPG Superstar contest. And we're focusing it mostly on monsters at first. This is our first step getting into this contest space, but we're coming at it from a very different angle. So the original contest, folks would have created a monster and a magic item and an organization, and at the very end, an adventure pitch, which would have eventually become an entire adventure. What we're going to do, what we are doing actually, and submissions are open now if you're interested in this, is folks go and make a second edition monster. You can do up to 2 entries, which is pretty cool, and which means you could win twice if they're 2 really good monsters. So people put in these monsters, and it's essentially a monster contest. But what we're going to do is myself and some other judges who are names in the industry, people who run publishing houses, whether for Paizo or third party, are going to be looking at these and going through and basically figuring out what we think the top crew of monsters is. And then we're going to open it up to the public for you to decide, what do you think the top 100 are? And the difference is this time, the top 100 all get published in a hardbound book. Like, we are going to make a book out of this. And there's cash money to be involved as well. So if you get published, you're going to get cash. If you get published, you're going to get a t-shirt. Like, we're going to give all this stuff away. I think there's over $20,000 worth of prizes. Like, it's nuts. We're kind of going all out. So it's like, yes, just a monster contest, but no, it's so much bigger than that. So
nice. That sounds like a lot of fun.
It's going to be a ball.
And who doesn't like creating monsters?
Right? Yeah, everyone, has this idea for one. They're like, oh, I have this idea for a monster that's really cool. Great. Write it for second edition, submit it to the contest, and let's just see.
And then part of it, too, is you have to be basically unpublished as well.
Yes, right. So, like, I'm the lead developer in it, but even if I wasn't involved in it, I would not be eligible based on my number of publications alone. So if you're someone who's already in the industry, cool, follow along, have some fun. But if you're someone like I was over 5 years ago thinking, oh, I just wish I had a publication, I just really want to be published, it would be super cool, this is your opportunity.
That is cool, because I remember when Wizards of the Coast did the campaign setting contest for 3rd edition, and we had entered a couple, and then when you finally got to the end and you got to the winners and the final winner, it's like, oh, this person is actually already a professional.
Oh.
So like Eberron was created by Keith Baker, but Keith Baker was already a professional game designer.
Right.
Not necessarily for Wizards of the Coast. Now, it was fantastic, and what he did was way better than what we did. But that being said, it felt kind of a little bit like cheating.
Well, maybe. I think in that sort of contest, it sort of makes sense. And it's like, oh, yeah, okay, someone professional is going to win this thing. Because at the time, Wizards of the Coast was trying to come up with a whole setting, right? They were like, What is our next big setting? And so that kind of made sense that they're just going to go out and be like, hey, whoever you are, whatever your background is, if you have a cool setting, great, we're going to do it. But for something like this, the focus isn't on, hey, we're going to do this entire line, and entire setting and books and all that stuff. It's no, we want to create a cool monster book, because everyone could use more monsters to pull from for their own home games. And it's something that everyone can create. Everyone's got an idea. So let's hear yours. And, trying to promote these folks. You can say, yeah, I contributed this monster that was in this hardback book. And, I got 5th place or whatever. So.
Nice. Now, this is the first time where you guys are kind of reviving it?
Yes, it hasn't gone for, I forget how many years, but several years that we have not had an RPG superstar in the industry from Paizo, and Roll for Combat has just picked it up, and we're going for it.
Do you guys kind of have like an internal expectation of how many submissions you might get?
I think there's a couple expectations. Mostly, I think that we're really looking forward to how many we get, and I think the expectation is that even though we're going to publish 100 monsters, we're expecting to have a lot of them that we're sad that we are not publishing, that maybe we can do something else with and talk to those people. But really, the idea is, hey, let's just get 100 really cool, solid monsters.
So no office pools.
Not that anyone's told me.
Next time before you start, you have to start an office pool, almost like a block pool for for sports ball games. So Dark Web wants to know, when you were doing homebrew monsters, do you ever take from Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh?
Like Magic the Gathering?
Yeah.
I'm actually not 100% familiar with those worlds. I dodged a bullet on Magic the Gathering, or at least my pocketbook did, way back when it came out. Because I remember when it was a brand new thing, and friends of mine were getting involved, and I'm like, yeah, I want to play this game. I want to get involved. And I forget what it was. It was like family vacation. We were gone for 2 weeks, whatever it was. That by the time I could get back to it and be like, okay, now I want to play this, they're like, great. So first spend a bunch of money buying a bunch of cards. And I was like, wait, I don't have a bunch of money. And then before I knew it, it was like, well, as soon as you're ready to invest like at least $100, then you can start playing this game. And I was like, oh, I am a poor college student. I can't do this.
I remember my partner Ted, who happens to be my brother-in-law, him and his friends, and they're a bit younger than me, so they were like still in high school and teens, and they would like pool their money together to buy whatever the big packs were, and then like sort them out and everything. And I just I guess just because of my age, I just kind of missed it and never got into it. And again, the same thing. Definitely feel like I dodged the bullet. But that being said, not that long ago, Ted pulled out all of his old cards, sold them, and bought a car.
Yeah, I know. At one point, I say dodged a bullet, but really I'm trying to make myself feel better because it was there at the beginning, or if I had bought these darn things, they'd be worth something. Now, I am the kind of fool who spent an embarrassing amount of money not quite completing a Final Fantasy VIII collector's card game that would mimic the cards game that was in the game itself, like the video game. And I didn't even finish it, and I still have this thing, and it's worth nothing because no one cares. And I'm sitting here thinking, but if I had spent that money on Magic, maybe some of that would be worth something these days. Who knows?
Yeah, I kind of did that a little bit with comic books, but at the time when I was buying them, they were printing so many, it didn't matter. Mm-hmm. It didn't matter what you had. So, but going back to monsters, where do you draw your inspiration?
A lot of it, I think a lot of it is honestly from my subconscious and whatever it's picked up, whatever garbage it's picked up along the way. I often find that I'll create a monster that I think is really cool, and then someone's like, that's really similar to this other thing from this movie. And I'm like, yeah, I watched that 15 years ago when it came out. And they're like, yeah, that's what it reminded me of. And I'm thinking, that is kind of similar. One of the monsters I've created that unfortunately is only in an adventure, it never made it into a bestiary for Pathfinder 1, is the Body Snatcher. And it's this undead thing that flies around, has no legs, has just sort of ragged flesh on the bottom, and a blank face. And then instead of arms, it has like 2 arms, and then where the elbows would be, splits off into 2 tentacles. So it's got these 4 tentacles. It's monstrous. It's horrible. And this thing essentially just has like an aura of silence, and so it will hide, and it's coming because everything suddenly gets eerily quiet and you can't make a noise, and it's nearby. Well, then it will wrap itself around you, like snag you into the woods or something, wrap its tentacles around you, and then detach them. and you are stuck. Think of like tied bound in ropes, except it's gross monster tentacles, and you still can't make a sound, and it just leaves you there for the tentacles to keep squishing you and killing you while it regrows 4 new tentacles and goes after your friends.
That is pretty nasty.
Now, this came up essentially because I just kept thinking, how can I make this worse, right? So I'm like, okay, I kind of want like a stealth boss for this, adventure I'm writing. And it slowly changed from like, I want something to snatch you. I want something to come out of the woods. I want it to be quiet. I want it to be weird. I want it to do this. And as I was, putting it together, I was just thinking, what else can I do to make the players afraid at the table, afraid for their characters? Because that doesn't happen too often, especially in first edition, especially in society. People are really good at making characters. And so all too often it's like, oh, it's the boss. Well, I guess I'll use my good abilities now and just win in one shot. And I wanted to disarm players of all of that and have a fight where all of a sudden they go, oh no, I don't know how to deal with this. I don't have a strategy. I'm actually going to have to like sit back and think of like, how are we, where did Janet's character go? Janet's character's gone. No one can find her. How do we find Janet's character? And just, put that panic into them. And as far as I know, it worked.
That sounds like a great monster, especially if you introduce it right. Like immediately when I think of that from the GM's point of view, I'm like, oh, I want to introduce an NPC that they find dead, constricted to death by one of these things, and then have them not know what the monster is. Until it comes out of nowhere and grabs one of the players. And then, and then like that player's like, oh, wait a minute. They're thinking of that NPC that got killed. Like Vargoyles is a great monster like that, where they're just like vampiric heads with bat wings. And,
they're so weird, but they're so creepy.
Yes.
And the fact that you might turn into one is so much worse.
And the best way to introduce them is to have it happen to somebody first, an NPC, and have their head just rip off and sprout bat wings and start attacking people.
Absolutely.
And then the next thing you know, the players are like, wait a minute, can this happen to us?
Yeah, those are fantastic. Any of those, even like whites and things that that if they take you down, you're going to turn into one.
Yeah.
Just make it so much scarier, especially at higher level play when you have those sorts of mechanics, because it's not just like, oh, I died, whatever, we'll pay some gold, we'll get revived. It's like, oh no, you might lose your character over this. Like, pay attention, and then it's just. Whew.
So if 5e shadows are kind of like that. They're like a really low CR monster that just like punches way above their weight class. But then if you die from them, you become a shadow. But if you do you can still be resurrected from that, but then you come back without a shadow.
Right.
Which is kind of like cool and creepy. So Firebrat has got another question. What about with class options? Is it difficult trying to create a unique option that folks haven't seen yet?
It's funny you should mention that. I am actually right now writing for Legendary Games, one of the third-party publishers for Pathfinder, and I believe they do 5th edition content as well. And I'm writing their Legendary Kineticist for 2nd edition. So way back in 1st edition, they did a Legendary Kineticist where they basically took that class, which, if you're not familiar, is all about elemental power, right? You're like, if you've seen any of the Airbender series, it's like, oh, I'm a firebender. Okay, that's a kineticist, right? I'm just so good with fire and absolutely nothing else. And they did their own spin, their own version. Well, it hasn't been introduced into 2nd edition, and there are folks like me that just love the kineticist and cannot wait. So I finally just said, hey, I'm just going to write it myself. So I'm actually working on that. And I'll tell you what, it's both difficult and not entirely difficult to make these options. So part of it is realizing sort of how a class is constructed. So you have a good balance of offensive options and defensive options and utility options, and you need to figure out exactly where you want to put those. So once you sort of have a map of like, here's how I need to balance it, it's not as hard because you want to give them a cool movement power, right? And then you just have to look at the theme of the class and think, what would be cool for fire? What would be cool for fire is if when you jumped, there was like a gout of fire behind you propelling you up into the air. That would be cool. What if there was an ability that when you ran really fast, you left like a trail of fire, like a wall of fire behind you? That's be cool. And so as you start coming up with these ideas, you just make them class features. Now, some of them are literally just like, hey, you just jump really high. And several classes have a you just jump really high mechanic, but this one has fire. So, it kind of depends.
So, and that also answers another question, because someone earlier had asked if there were psionics in Pathfinder, which obviously there are.
Sort of, yeah. So for Pathfinder First Edition, Dreamscard Press did a fantastic psionics package, which led Paizo to basically say, hey, we kind of don't need to do psionics in that way, and they did occult classes instead, which is a little more of the, excuse me, a little more of the creepy, like medium spiritualist sort of, psionics or psychic magic. And they've brought that forward into second edition with the bard, actually, and said, okay, the bard is our primary occultist class for spellcasting. And when you think about it, you're like, well, bard, aren't they like singing and stuff? Except that they're not just singing. They're like tales and lore. And let me tell you this story that is so intense, it has a magical effect, right? Let me tell you about this ancient hero that did this thing and then draw power from it. And so that's really cool about how they kind of built in psychic magic in that way. And so a lot of the different classes then in Pathfinder Second Edition can be psionic or at least occulty in that way, because you kind of get your power source from wherever. If you're a sorcerer, the magic's in your blood, but it can still manifest as like, I just know it. I can just do it. And you give them psychic type options, and then that's your character.
So Joe wants to know, what do you think about Faekin beast folk?
Ooh, tell me about Faekin beast folk. I know what that springs to mind, but what specifically do you think Joe is talking about?
I don't actually know. I didn't know if it was a Pathfinder specific thing or not, which I haven't delved there very much. But in all fairness, there is a lot of Pathfinder stuff. So
there is a lot of Pathfinder stuff.
even if you were like the lead designer for the company, there's a possibility someone could say something and I'd be like, I don't know what that is.
I don't know specifically Faekin beast folk, so if you'll let us know, that would be great. But what it evokes for me, I love the Fae. I think that's a place I would love to write more, actually, because they're so alien in how they think, right? Things are, especially in the world of Galarian, where the Pathfinder setting takes place, Fae from the first world, from their own native world, are immortal. If you kill them, they just appear later some other time, and they're in this timeless realm, so it doesn't really matter to them. And they play these games, they're downright deadly, because to them it's not a big deal. So what? You died, you'll come back, it's fine. And they just don't have the same concepts of life and death and consequences that we would have like on the mortal plane. And so from that aspect, they are so interesting, because now they get into the mortal plane and they don't understand, well, why are you running away? I'm just throwing knives at you. You're supposed to dodge them and throw the knives back. And you're like, what is this game?
That's totally a great way to look at it. It makes me think of, the Unseelie Court, or, the Wild Fae. In Dresden Files, they have the Seelie, Unseelie Court, and then Wild Fae, which aren't really part of either. Mm-hmm. But the Earl King kind of rules the Wild Fae, and that brings images to mind for me, like the Wild Hunt.
Yeah, exactly, that sort of thing. It looks like Joe made a bit of a clarification on like raccoon folk and stuff like that. So the animalistic races, I think, are kind of neat. I think it's I'm of two minds. One, I think it's kind of cool because I like cats and cat folk, and like, who doesn't? So that's kind of fun. It's also kind of fun to think of this idea of like, you know what, right now, cats, or in your case, let's say raccoons are really intelligent, right? What if they were hyper intelligent and evolved to be more humanoid-like? They could be a race. And honestly, that sounds kind of neat to me. So if that works in your game and in your world, I think it's cool. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. On the other hand, sometimes I think that you can make fantasy races that aren't just like, it's a raccoon person or it's a cat person, but you can really say, what sort of reality would this race, this culture, this species have to grow up in, have to develop in, to have these specific weird traits? And honestly, that's one thing that Starfinder has in spades, if you look through their alien archives, which are like their monster manuals or bestiaries, if you look through the alien archives, there's a ton of sentient races in there that are just bizarre, but they all make sense within the context of their planet's unique ecology. And you're like, okay, that's cool. And that's one of the fun things about Starfinder too, is just the wonderful cantina feeling of just all these outlandish and distinctly different alien races, and yet they're all just like, I don't know, whatever, I'm gonna have another ale, you know. It's like, okay.
So that makes me think of whenever my wife sees a cute animal, she's like, can I have one? And I go, well, let's see, can you? And then I ask Google if this makes a good pet, and invariably it never does. And the raccoon came up recently, and it's like, actually they do, except for if you leave them alone, they get bored and they will destroy your home. So there is that. But yeah, you know, the animal races, and there's several RPGs that have sprung up off of essentially playing different animals, in addition to them being incorporated in Pathfinder, D&D, and pretty much every other game. So it's definitely there, and people love them.
Oh yeah, I remember when Catfolk, there was like a outside way to get Catfolk in first edition Pathfinder Society. It was really hard, and there were very few of them, and people just went nuts for it. You know, or like Ratfolk finally got made a core so that anyone could make a Ratfolk, you know, and people made them in droves because it's like, oh, I want a cute little rat guy who's just gonna, like, you know, be also tall, like tiny and short and scampery. And it's like, okay.
Maybe, or they're Warhammer fans and they just want Skaven.
I saw a decent amount of that too.
Which, you know, everyone knows the best Skaven leaders, the bravest, lead from the back. So Dark Web wants to know what happened to Vermin Type, like Undead and Beast.
Oh, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, some of those are still in there. The types and subtypes are a little less rigid than they were before, which I think is great. Because in 1st Edition, monsters were created using a very mechanic-rich system that depended heavily on, well, is it a vermin or is it undead? And you're like, well, what if it's both? And you're like, can't be both. Is it vermin or is it undead? And if you wanted it to be both, you had to do a lot of twisting of stuff. In 2nd Edition, it's nice because now the type doesn't have as much direct impact on the stats in a prescriptive way, meaning like, hey, if you want it to be an aberration, it has to have these 7 things. It's like, no, aberrations just tend to have some of these things. And then now it's a descriptive thing, which is fantastic because now I can say, well, I have vermin undead, and they're both vermin and undead, and I can still make the rules work the way that they need to for this creature without being strapped down or harnessed to anything. And then they can really work for a designer instead of against them.
Red Jackal, do you consider ecology when creating creatures for your setting and or dungeons?
100% yes, absolutely. I always consider ecology. I always want that verisimilitude of, why is this creature here? Why does it make sense that there is an ogre living next door to an ooze, right? It's not just there. They don't just get along, right? It's an ooze. But instead, if the ooze has been sort of trained using its instinct for feeding, that the ogre will come along every once in a while and throw, you know, its bones and scraps and things it's not going to eat in gristle. Then the ooze eats it and it's content. It knows it doesn't have to go anywhere for food. It'll just sit there, you know, and it's like little puddle or pit, let's say. And now the ogre has a pit trap with an ooze in it because it, you know, it feeds it every day. And now it makes sense that they're there. So I always want the creatures that are there to have a logical reason for existing. And I will often, especially if it's more of like a sandbox dungeon, I'll often explain in there or put in there so the GM knows, like, this is why this monster is chilling in this room. It's not just because I needed another, you know, level 7 encounter. It's like, no, it's here for this reason.
So when you think about monster design, where do you usually start for the conceptually? Do you start with the mechanics or do you start with the story?
I have started from both positions depending on what I'm creating it for. For that body snatcher we talked about, I created that one originally starting from mostly mechanics. And I say mostly because it was sort of in a very undead themed portion of the adventure. And honestly, this thing could have been an aberration and just been fine. But because of that, it was definitely undead. And that, because it was first edition, informed a lot of its abilities and how things would work. But at the same time, like that one was very mechanically driven, right? I wanted a creature that hit certain notes, that did certain things in the encounter. And so I figured out what those were, how they would fit together, and then wrap the story around it. On the other hand, I've created monsters from another one where I said, I want to create one monster that's in an adventure that's not out yet, but I'm going to give you a sneak preview. I wanted to create the domesticated house animal for aberrations. If you're an aberrant race of some sort and you had a pet, what would this pet be? And so on that one, I very much went from a story point of view and then ended up creating mechanics around it and said, okay, so story-wise, I think I would do this, and I think aberrations would think that was cool, so I'm going to do that, and then I guess it has these mechanics. And so I ended up with this creature that's essentially like a big head with a big mouth. Think like Pac-Man, but kind of gross and like rubbery. And it's got these two big giant legs. And it spits acid. So this big thing kind of gurgles and spits acid, and it likes to bounce around on these two legs, and it doesn't have arms. It just has legs and a head, essentially. And it bounces around, and the way it eats its food is to bounce into things with its big rubbery body and knock them down and then eat it on the ground. And if it needs to, like if the darn thing it's trying to eat just won't stay still, it might, spit some acid at it or something to slow it down.
It makes me think of an armless MODOK.
An armless MODOK?
Yeah.
I'm going to have to Google search that. What is it?
MODOK is a villain. I might even be saying the name wrong because that's like a trademark of mine. Comic Book University weighed in on the Raccoons. Raccoons organized. I have witnessed the conspiracy. A massive squadron tried a night raid on my army squad once. We were illegitimately afraid. How could you not be afraid? They have masks and everything.
I'm wondering if this was in real life or if this was a game. I have only been raided by raccoons once in real life.
I think it's real life. So he was in the army, so.
Oh, okay. I was in film school for a while, and we were doing a night shoot, and it happened to be kind of close to these dumpsters that apparently the raccoons like to go to every night, because as we're shooting, all of a sudden we look, and they're the little shiny eyes of all these raccoons on this like hillock near the dumpster, and they're looking at us like, you're really close to our food. And as the night went on, because film shooting takes forever, as the night went on, we keep shooting, and they keep getting closer and closer and closer as they're getting a little more daring to be like, we want to go get our food out of that dumpster, and you guys are in the way. And finally they just decided to get in the dumpster, and there were like two of them that came right over to where we were and basically yelled at us. They came over making all sorts of very aggressive sounds and posturing, and then ran back to the dumpster as if to tell us, get the heck out of here. This is our dinner.
This movie is about to be about a raccoon gang war.
Yeah, so we wrapped up real quick and left because those raccoons looked like they were going to get aggressive. And we're like, okay, we're on their turf. I guess we're going to leave.
Yeah, wild animals, no joke. And that's why I keep trying to tell my wife, no, we can't have these things as pets. Yeah. Although I did find that apparently bats make really good pets, but you will shorten their life by a lot if you do so. So I'm like, I found one for you, babe, but you're gonna have to keep replacing them, which is not good. We need bats.
I know, and they're adorable too.
Her spirit animal is the sloth, and that's what she really wants. And I'm like, you can't have a sloth. She's had both of her hips replaced recently, so.
Oh, okay.
It slowed her down a little bit for now.
I see. Yeah, well for now, but once those bionics set in, she'll be unstoppable.
That's what I keep saying. You just need, those pistons to warm up a bit. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was about to start talking about hip replacement surgeries, but they're gross. They're very.
Oh yeah.
The ortho doctors are so graphic in their explanations, and it is a medieval practice, I believe, For sure.
Comic Book University says that bats are awesome. They inspired them to roam the city at night and make their city safe, which,
Yeah,
like you do.
basically. So Comic Book University is a friend of the channel. He's got his own
Okay.
YouTube channel where he talks about, here's a shocker, comic books.
Oh, jeez. I thought it would be about, using comic books in pedagogy, but what do I know?
Yeah. And he is prolific. He's got like 1 million videos over there. So if there's anything you want to know about comics, it is probably a great place to look.
That's cool. Have you played any superhero games or systems?
Yes, actually, Comic Book University ran a phase rip game for us. We did 2 seasons of it, so it was like 24 episodes. Which is, I don't know if you're familiar with Marvel Phase Rip, which is from the 80s.
Okay.
So we played that. I played when I was a kid. That's actually what got me into reading comic books. Because everyone someone picked the Hulk and Thor and Silver Surfer already. So I'm like, well, I need a strong character to go adventuring with these characters or be in the same group. And I found a character, Box, who I had no idea who it was, and it was kind of a more obscure character because it was Alpha Flight Canadian superheroes.
Oh, okay.
So I started reading those, and that's kind of how I had gotten into comics. But then years later, we picked up Mutants and Masterminds by Green Ronin as well, and we've been playing that for a while.
I have only played that once at a one-shot, and I really want to play it again. It was so much fun. And I remember it like brought back a bunch of nostalgia for me because my big superhero gaming kick was back in high school where we played, or actually early college, now that I'm really thinking about it, where we played a bunch of different systems. And one of them was the old Champion system that was run by Fusion. And we had Mecton, which was also compatible with Fusion, and the Fusion plugin and Cyberpunk system that was Fusion compatible. And we took all these Fusion compatible systems and combined them into this epic superhero game. And we played that for a year and a half or so with rotating GMs. So everyone at the table had a character in the game, but it was one of those things where if you were GMing that week, your character was probably busy or was the quest giver, one of the two.
Yeah.
Or was in peril, right? And so they had to come save you or something. And that way you could run the game without your character being directly involved and run it for everyone else. And it was awesome because everyone got to GM and everyone got to play. And we kept telling stories from different angles, like often happens in comic books. You get a new author on it and the field changes a little bit. And then you go back to another author and the field changes again. And it was is amazing.
It really lends itself to being episodic as well. Mm-hmm. So that part of one of those games is a lot easier. Where the way that I got into Mutants and Masterminds was someone wanted to run Heroes Unlimited from Palladium.
Okay.
And so we started playing that, and that was the idea. Is like, well, I'm going to run this game, and whoever's available, then it's the call went out, and people show up. But I didn't like the system.
Yeah.
And so I started looking around, and there was two of them that kind of came up, and it was Mutants and Masterminds and Champions. And when I started doing research, it's like, well, Mutants and Masterminds is a D20 system. We're all used to D20. And so we started diving into that, and that is a fantastic system. I guess that was 2nd edition. And we ended up playing a bunch of games with that. We ended up playing Dresden Files campaign. We ended up playing just a fantasy game with it. And we played Supers with it. And then 3rd edition came out for Mutants and Masterminds, which is even better. It's like with each edition, they got further away from the D&D isms. But still kept like the core mechanics where if you understood a D20 system, you could jump in and learn it fairly easily. But the further they got away from those D&D isms just made the game that much better. Like the last edition, they got rid of stats. Instead, they just used the bonus because what's the point? It's kind of redundant.
Yeah, 10 to 18, and you're doing all this math. It's actually one of the holdovers in Pathfinder 2nd edition. I kind of wish they had changed. Is just make it just the bonus. Yeah. And I hear they were like this close to doing it, but only because of that, classic nostalgia feel that they keep in the actual stats.
Yeah. There's these like sacred cows that they're just not willing to quite kill yet. And there's certain things like the stat can go away, alignment can probably go away. I don't know about 2nd edition Pathfinder, but in 5th edition D&D, it's like the alignment doesn't come up at all. Like there
Like at
might
all.
be like a magic item or two that has an alignment requirement, but other than that, it is
Yeah.
just meaningless words.
And honestly, I think that's nice because then it becomes kind of like I was saying before, like alignment becomes more of a description instead of a prescription. It's not like, oh, I'm chaotic good, then that means in this situation I have to do this. It's like, no, 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 no. If you're chaotic good, then and that's how you describe your character, then act that way. And if there's a situation where they would do something lawful for very specific reasons, then they do something lawful. Like, don't worry about it. You know,
Now, I will say with the superhero angle, getting rid of the stat super makes sense because, like, I don't know, as a kid, you collected, like, the cards with the superheroes and they had the stats on one side. And, you know, using just the modifier actually felt a lot more like that. So,
yeah, I had the Marvel cards when I was a kid, and I had almost the entire set of that too. I had probably 95% of the Marvel ones, and it was pretty cool. I was only missing some of those like big storyboard ones where you had to have all nine to make the big picture.
yeah.
Those are the only ones I was missing.
Dang it. And then,
I know.
yeah, and then with those, it was always like a power bar, and it was a number that was relatively low, like 1 through 10. So,
Right, and most of the heroes that you thought, wow, this is a really powerful hero, is like, oh yeah, their strength, they're the strongest person you can think of. It's like a 6.
yeah.
I'm like, what? How is it a 6? And you're like, well, because there's this like cosmic character over here that has a 9. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah. But that being said, when you go into like, you know, when you look at D&D stats and you're just using the modifier, then it kind of does make more sense. So it works for sure. So we're up on the hour mark. Is there
Okay.
anything you want to say before we head on out?
Uh, Definitely go check out RPG Superstar. Especially if you have any inkling. I put a link in chat. There's going to be a link attached there. Definitely go check that out. It is one of the best ways you can just get involved in the industry if you're really wanting to write and you haven't had the opportunity to get your feet wet. Go do it. The monster submission ends June 12th, so that gives you a couple months to come up with something and make a few submissions. You get 2, which is pretty darn cool.
Awesome. So with
Yeah.
that, we're going to head on out. Thanks for being a guest and coming on. Really appreciate it. I enjoyed
Thanks.
talking with you. And until next time, everyone, stay nerdy.